After the crowd funneled across the field with the protagonist's secret still pressed to his palm, a solitary step fell hard on the ground and drew immediate focus. He froze at the sound, eyes snapping wide with the recognition of imminent danger. He moved, a blur of motion across steel and shadow, and the scene snapped outward from his footfall to a larger tracking net. Red arcs cut across an electronic map, while purple pings detonated at nodes, each mark blooming into a new point of interest. The detection sweep widened until the view scaled out to a globe, threaded with the same crimson rings and purple beats, a planetary lattice of attention that began to draw something in return. At the edges of that net, silhouettes and ambiguous forms tilted and rose, shadows answering the call. Whatever had been sleeping at the margins shifted and leaned toward the lines of light, setting the stage for confrontation. After the net of red arcs and purple pings spread outward, the protagonist remained planted on the scarred circle as a dark fissure in the rock yawned open. Purple glyphs traced forward and fell into the cavern like crawling sentries. The view cut into the mouth of the hollow, where a harsh, golden flare revealed a litter of bones and a single focal brightness at its center, then drew outward to show a living shadow assembling from the dark, claws, a gaping maw, and an impossible height that swallowed the light. The protagonist recoiled, whispering disbelief, while speech fragments hung in the air, hints of a thing that devoured higher ranks, and the revelation struck him hard. Heat and fear coaxed something from inside him. His irises ignited with yellow light as he processed the threat and braced himself for whatever the cavern would unleash. After the cavern's shadow and the protagonist's sudden flare of warning, the scene cut to a rooftop and then down to a small cluster of recruits assembled against the cityscape. Two figures loomed in the foreground, while another offered an embarrassed apology. The exchange felt awkward and brief, and a companion addressed Aang with concern as tension flickered between them. A voice called names, Si Nuo and Yaohui, and pointed out a fourth person standing behind, announcing that those named would be placed together, which caused a ripple of surprise and quick acceptance. The group straightened as orders came from above, and the camera drew back to show the training ground and lines of participants already arranged below. As the leader urged haste, the rest are already ready. The recruits answered and moved toward the waiting field, the private moment folding into the larger, urgent preparation. The rooftop's private moment ended with light teasing and a flustered apology as protagonist and pink recruit exchanged barbed good humor. Aang watched with a quiet, reflective expression, while Lan Sinuo touched a companion's shoulder and urged movement. Names were called and groupings confirmed. What had been an awkward pause folded into a practical urgency, so the recruits straightened, answered the orders, and marched toward the training field. Pink recruit flashed a victory pose and captured the moment, announcing their newly formed team with bright relief. At the field, the camera pulled back to reveal a stark black monolith identified as a Dispel Steel, its label noting that it contained a special substance able to dispel the fog. A Helix official in red distinguished robes stood before the assembled students and began the trial briefing, his presence formal and commanding. The recruits listened as the testing ground, the steel, and the rules that would shape their rankings were made painfully clear, and a hush fell over them as they awaited the next instruction. The Helix official distributed weapons and compact dispeller units to the recruits and demonstrated the device up close. Recruits received quick instructions, and a camera-style diagram showed the Dispel Steel at the testing ground. He explained the mission: enter the fog outside the wall, insert a dispeller into the steel to clear the haze, and hunt the demons within. Performance would be judged individually. The assembled students, including protagonist, pink recruit, Lan Sinuo, and Aang, absorbed the terse rules and the warning that this was the last real test they would face. As the briefing closed, the scene shifted into the fog itself, where red eyes punctured the darkness and shadowy, revered hand demons waited. The panels cut to kinetic combat vignettes and exhortations to defeat fear, ending on recruits charging into uncertain battle against unknown presences beyond the wall. The panel opened on snarling revered hand demons as the test parameters were stated again: obtain vision, hunt the demons that spawned across the field, and secure the first kill to earn the title of warrior. Recruits plunged into chaotic, cinematic skirmishes against the red-eyed beasts. Vignettes showed fighters pressing forward, tearing into flesh, and a handful of creatures collapsing under coordinated blows. When the horn sounded, the helix exam concluded, and commanders called the next group forward, while the camera pulled back to reveal the scarred battlefield below. Smears of blood and scattered bodies testified to how costly the trial had been. From a high ledge, a red-haired second captain surveyed the scene with detached interest. She announced that, despite the promising novices, her purpose was specific. She was only interested in Si Chiliu. The sequence closed on her confident, assessing gaze as the recruits were ushered away. The aftermath played out on a sunlit ledge as exhausted novices peered down at the scarred testing ground and voices assessed performance. The protagonist leaned forward while a red-haired second captain and others watched from behind. A closer shot lingered on the protagonist's face as evaluative praise drifted, a murmured claim that he might yet become an excellent warrior, and the blonde commander folded his arms, noting there was still someone who had not been gathered. The camera dropped to the open space below where recruits gathered, and a dark-haired figure named Aang met the world with a half-smile, his eyes bright despite his condition. The blonde commander reflected that he had checked the recruits' core and found no obvious fault, recalling that he had meant only to inspect but had instead gone to him. A final private beat showed a quiet, awkward moment of concern and recognition among the ranks as the cohort dispersed. Sunlight struck across the ledge as the pink-haired recruit leaned in with a teasing question and called the blonde trainee Tang Tang, prompting his indignant, red-faced denial while a dark-haired companion watched. Laughter and mild chaos rippled through the nearby recruits as jibes and protests bounced between them, but the mood tightened when a woman inspected the situation and observed that the demon rank was fixed. An older official then confirmed that verification had been completed. Only arranged illness, demons were within the exam's scope, and the site had been checked repeatedly for safety. He told them not to worry, and the scene drew back to reveal the fortified examination arena full of candidates. The reassurances hung over the field as the assembled ranks prepared for the test with the promise that no unexpected demon would surface. Perched on the observation ledge, the blue-haired man offered a half-smile and a dry remark about the possibility of a lone, real threat, his tone equal parts amusement and resolve. He and the blonde officer leaned forward to take in the wide, stripped training ground where small dots, the assembled candidates, clustered and practiced. The red-haired captain stood nearby, silent and watchful. Even with earlier assurances that only arranged illness, demons would be involved, and that the site had been checked, the sight of the field hardened their faces. They agreed, without fanfare, that protecting these future warriors would demand every precaution they could muster. The brief levity faded into a focused calm as the three exchanged looks above the arena, the sweep of the fortified exam grounds below underscoring how much was at stake for the recruits who would soon be tested. A stark, demonic sigil and portrait opened the sequence, its crimson tendrils and skulls setting a grim counterpoint to the human figures that followed. The protagonist, framed in a tight close-up, allowed a half-smile and a dry, measured line when the prospect of a genuine threat was raised. The remark carried more resolve than levity. He and the blonde commander leaned over the observation ledge together, while the second captain watched nearby, taking in the wide, stripped training ground where candidates clustered like distant specks. Despite prior assurances that only controlled illness, demons would be present, their faces hardened at the sweep of the arena, and they silently agreed that safeguarding the recruits would demand every precaution. After that compact exchange, the scene cut back to the title imagery and credits, then closed on a loud proclamation from below that the group's test was over, underscoring the palpable tension between ceremony and danger. Following the earlier briefing and the somber exchange among the officers, a booming announcement declared the next group's turn, and a cloud of dust rolled across the wide training ground. The protagonist and his teammates, Lan Sinuo and the pink-haired onlooker, stood together and confirmed their readiness while distant figures still lingered in the arena. A small, metallic device was passed into the protagonist's hand. He turned it over in mild surprise, uncertain of its purpose. Before he could dwell, the white-haired, cocky recruit surged forward in a theatrically fast dash. shouting a provocation and trailing sweeping motion lines that marked her as eager for attention. Her performance split the moment between practical trial and showmanship, and the protagonist's inward sneer betrayed impatience at her craving for the spotlight. As she streaked ahead, the test resumed under the same tense, ceremonial atmosphere that had settled over the field, the recruits' resolve tested by both spectacle and danger. After the announcement, the group surged forward across the sun-baked training ground. The protagonist ran with Lan Sinuo, and the onlooking pink recruit trailing nearby, while the brash, white-haired recruit ripped ahead. She vaulted into a high, twisting somersault that carved the air, her boots gouging arcs in the earth, and whipping up a ring of sand and wind that blurred the world below. The spinning descent drove a small metallic object to roll and skitter through dust toward a shallow recess in the course. The device came to rest at the lip, and the opening inside pulsed a sudden red light. Dust and motion hung in the instant that followed, recruits frozen in mid-stride, as the training ground's mechanical response made the trial tangible, the ceremony shifting into a dangerous, immediate test of reflex and nerve. The trial's sudden mechanical response had barely registered before the onlooking pink recruit tore a delighted observation about lineage and skill, framing the scene as something almost theatrical. The ground split open to reveal snarling, red-eyed revered hand demons, their jagged visages flaring into motion as they lunged toward the recruits with bestial howls. Panic rippled through the line, commands cut across the dust, and a leader, eyes fixed, shouted for Sinuo to make a path. Lan Sinuo answered without hesitation, feet carving a whipping cyclone that tore sand into the air. He launched forward in a spinning, tornado-like strike aimed at scattering the charging demons. From above, the training field became a blur of motion, dust plumes, leaping bodies, and the relentless advance of the enemies, while the remaining recruits skidded into new positions, forced to turn a ceremonial test into an immediate fight for survival. Lan Sinuo's cyclone of motion expanded into a blurring halo of sand and golden light as his spinning strike met the lunging revered hand demons. Each collision sent crackling arcs outward that ripped at the fiends and tore at the training ground. The swirling current funneled enemy momentum into brutal impacts, shoving lesser demons aside and leaving others reeling under showers of energy from Sinuo's gauntlet. The field became a kaleidoscope of bodies, teeth, and lightning, attacks that started as a test now read as decisive defense. From the edge of the chaos, a watchful official observed with a mixture of curiosity and approval and spoke, aloud that the recruit was already adept at harnessing the core's strength. The moment tightened into a single, telling image, the official's hand closing around a spinning cylindrical device that thrummed with latent power, the source that had amplified the assault and promised further shifts in the trial's stakes. Shouts cut across the arena as an unseen voice ordered, "Kill them all one by one," and someone urgently called, "Liui." Yaohui, the pink-haired recruit, flashed an eager K tilde, while a pale, white-haired ally shot back, "I don't need you to tell me," and both steeled themselves. Their boots struck the training ground in a blur, panel edges emphasizing the surge forward, as a golden spherical ward flared around another participant, and blades were drawn. Dark silhouettes, the revered hand demons, convulsed and swooped at the edges of the frame, while the Helix official's cylindrical device continued to hum from the perimeter, its latent power still seeding the upheaval. The moment snapped into a crisp announcement of combat. Round 1, the graphic declaring the trial's formal start, and the sequence closed on a tight, determined stare from the pink recruit as the pair charged headlong into the fray. The sequence opened with the pink recruit lunging into the fray, shouting as she slashed through a mass of crimson tentacles while streaks of light crisscrossed the field. Her partner moved in close, driving a precise kick into the creature and stamping on its flesh as the hulking red form began to tumble. A shouted delivery punctuated the throw as the armored construct went airborne and slammed down. Before the enemy could regroup, the blonde commander stepped forward and unleashed a golden-charged punch into the fallen adversary, the blow erupting in a shock of force and searing light that sprayed green ichor and sand across the arena. The revered hand demons convulsed and fragmented under the impact as the two combatants hit the dirt and rolled clear, leaving a rent, explosive wake where the enemy once stood. After the field had been torn open and the revered hand demons shattered, the crowd and onlookers took stock of the surviving fighters and their unexpectedly smooth coordination. From the lip of the arena, the protagonist watched with quiet amusement while other recruits noted, admiringly, how the girl with the blue ability core moved as if in rhythm with her partner. A nearby voice half-jokingly warned to keep one's eyes off her. The announcer cut through the chatter. Round 2 was on. A silver-haired round 2 opponent narrowed a blood-red eye and then sprung, driving a blurring strike through the air. The impact rang out with a shout and released a sickly green discharge that hit the soil. A heavy step followed, and where the energy struck a viscous, neon mound began to bubble up and spread across the sand, leaving the arena charged and the next confrontation imminent. Tension boiled over as a raw roar split the air, and the neon mass on the sand writhed in reaction. The crowd flinched while the protagonist watched from the lip of the arena. The silver-haired round 2 opponent moved like a coiled blade, closing distance with a blurred strike that sent the viscous, sickly green discharge rippling outward. She slid low across the sand, lips parting to issue a single, cold command: explode. The word detonated the charged mound into a blinding, green conflagration that threw up soil and light and left the pit crackling. As the smoke rolled away, the announcer's voice cut in, round 3. The field answered with an abrupt shift. New fighters spilled into close quarters, and a red-armored assailant and an agile opponent collided in a brutal grapple that signaled the next sequence of desperate, up-close combat. Smoke and dust still lingered from the prior detonation when the arena shifted into its next, more intimate phase. The announcer's call for round 3 had barely died when fighters closed, and the protagonist moved with cold precision. He declared his intent to hit 3 vital points, then dove in like a coiled blade: neck, chest, abdomen, each strike punctuated by a flash of impact and a streak of cutting light. The red-armored opponent reeled under the surgical onslaught, limbs stretching and folding, as the protagonist followed through with driving momentum that threw his foe into the sand. Between blows, the protagonist's assessment ran aloud: the weaker body's explosive ceiling, the opportunity to push and evaluate what the frame could bear. As dust stung the air and the opponent slid away, the protagonist steadied himself, muscles taut and ready to press the advantage and keep testing those fragile limits. The arena still tasted of smoke and grit when round 3 sharpened into close quarters. The announcer's din had barely faded before combat closed again. The protagonist stated his intent and moved like a coiled instrument, diving in with cold geometry to target vital points in rapid succession. Each hit landed with a flash and a streak of slicing light, his motion traced by a thin red vector that drove through the picture as if measuring damage. The red-armored opponent crumpled and contorted under those calculated strikes, limbs folding as the momentum threw him back across the sand. Between blows, the protagonist vocalized his assessment of the body's limits, its explosive ceiling, and how far he could push, turning the fight into both assault and experiment. As grit stung eyes and the fallen warrior slid away, the protagonist steadied himself, muscles coiled and ready to press the advantage and continue probing fragility with ruthless precision. The protagonist closed with a falling, surgical assault, blades and vectors cutting the air as he aimed for structural weakness. Mid-assault, the red-armored opponent ruptured outward into a crimson, horned manifestation, skulls and writhing tendrils suggesting a sudden demonic evolution, and unleashed a brutal, sweeping counterstroke meant to crush. The blow hammered toward the protagonist with earth-shaking momentum, but he met it not with brute resistance, but with a measured, spinning interception that sapped the strike's efficacy. Up close, he registered the crucial detail: the transformed foe was powerful but slow to correct its balance. A bright staccato moment of contact flashed, and the protagonist used the opening to pivot and reorient his attack angle, eyes fixed on exploiting the opponent's lag, while the crowd's roar blurred into the background. The protagonist lunged in with a surgical, spinning assault and met the red-armored opponent's sudden crimson metamorphosis head-on. When the transformed foe threw a massive, earth-shaking sweep, the protagonist redirected and sapped the strike's force with a measured spin, noting how the demon's bulk betrayed poor physical coordination and left a fleeting opening. He exploited that lag, slashing and driving into the gap. Blood and momentum followed as the two traded brutal contact. For a heartbeat it seemed decisive, but the protagonist's power burst fell short. His follow-through was declared insufficient, and the red antagonist recovered its tempo, erupting back into violent motion. The clash ricocheted across the ground as the protagonist was forced to adapt to the renewed onslaught. The crowd's roar reduced to background thunder, while the duel tightened into another tense exchange. Spectators watched the battlefield as a dark, winged silhouette passed overhead and whispered speculations. The pink recruit and others marveled at how easily Aang had been overwhelmed and at the protagonist's conspicuous wings. A red-haired observer commented with thin amusement as the viewing party, including Lan Sinuo and allied recruits, traded glances, while the blonde commander maintained a detached scrutiny. From a distance, the protagonist and the red-armored opponent remained tiny figures in a dust-streaked arena. The protagonist paused to breathe and internally ran a terse self-evaluation. He concluded the body was compromised, that movement would only grant him a little breath, and that his assessment was finished. No sooner had he finished thinking than the red-armored opponent surged forward in a brutal charge. The enemy closed across the sand and descended upon the protagonist, whose yellow eyes flashed with a hard, resigned focus as the clash recommenced. The red-armored opponent dove from above and slammed into the sand with explosive force, sending grit and shockwaves toward the scattered onlookers. From a distance, Lan Sinuo and the others watched helplessly as someone cried out, "YVES," while another cursed that the core had been hit. The small figures braced as the red attacker bore down. A massive, horned silhouette rose black against the sky, an ominous shape that lent the moment a demonic gravity. The next strikes found their mark. The protagonist was pierced, blood and a sickly green aura spraying from the wound as the enemy's weapon bit deep. Amid the chaos, a close, gruesome glimpse showed bone and talon-like forms where flesh should be, a hand or skull clenched around something vital. Despite the devastation, the protagonist's eyes flared with strange green light, the battle's stakes and the unknown presence's menace made unmistakably clear. A massive horned maw had filled the sky, and its roar washed over the stunned perimeter as red stains streaked the air and ground below. From the rooftop, the blonde commander's face drained of composure as his eyes widened in fearful recognition. He declared the thing a single-finned, mackerel demon and ordered everyone back to the city at once. Soldiers and recruits, Lan Sinuo among them, turned and fled, screams and shouts tearing across the sand as commanders pushed the retreat. Close faces registered shock and dread in fractured panels, then a wide angle showed the battlefield littered with a crater and the approaching menace. Civilians bolted for safety. Even with wounds already on him, the protagonist did not remain idle. He and another attacker launched themselves forward in a blur, cutting through the chaos toward the unknown presence as the evacuation swallowed the rest of the defenders. A wind of sand and fractured sound swept across the compound, the empty plaza stung by spiraling dust and the echo of retreat. Buildings and barricades blurred beneath the storm as people fell back toward the city, leaving the battlefield raw and exposed. Captain Ginny leapt forward amidst the chaos, shouting calm into panic and assuring the evacuees she would lead them safely inside, her voice cutting over the howl of fleeing feet. From a darker vantage, a stranger watched closely, voice hushed and incredulous as they noted humans bearing an unfamiliar, demonic aura. Close-ups pinned their astonishment to yellow eyes that searched the crowd. The sequence ended with a chilling close-up of a skull-masked demon. It leaned in, teeth bared, and demanded to know which one among them possessed it, turning the retreat into a moment of accusation and dread. As the evacuation still rattled in the air, the compound's chaos spilled into sudden, brutal violence. A burst of blood and a lethal strike opened the sequence, and nearby observers traded sharp, incredulous lines about the creature they were seeing, calling it unlike the earlier deformities. A writhing, green-tentacled form lay helpless, its voice confessing utter immobility as armored observers watched with growing alarm. The skull-masked envoy stepped forward, its leer and words dangling a cruel clause about a contract and what it would grant to whoever claimed the killing. The protagonist met that provocation with a tight, controlled calm. His eyes took on a hard edge, and he resolved to act. He extended a clawed hand that flared with red sigils and chains, and in one sweeping, violent gesture crimson bindings erupted to seize and pull multiple figures upward into a looming red aperture. The sudden, supernatural retrieval flung the witnessing officers into stunned silence, their faces turned upward as shadowed bodies vanished into the blood-red sky. After the crimson aperture had swallowed multiple bodies, the protagonist surged forward in a single, raw motion, fury tearing from his voice as he demanded what the skull-masked envoy had taken. He launched himself into the hollow and lashed out with desperate force, scattering debris and tearing at the looming darkness. The skull demon met the assault with an almost casual exhale, its hollow laugh brief and cold before it permitted the ground itself to convulse. A concussive shock and a keening wind overturned the sand. The torn, screaming shapes vanished into a newly opened rift as the envoy murmured another curt farewell. Officers and onlookers on the rim froze, shouting questions that went unanswered as the chasm sealed and silence fell. In the settling dust, a carved sigil pulsed faintly, an ominous residue of the void that had taken the candidates, while the protagonist and the watching survivors stood battered and incredulous at what had been lost. After the void had closed and the dust settled, the arena was marked not only by loss but by a fresh scar. A long, smoking trail cut through the sand and widened into a fresh fissure leading away from the sealed chasm. Survivors still shuddered from what had been taken, and a faint carved sigil glowed where the rift had been, an unshakable residue of that absence. On the far rim, two dark figures paused, framed against the ruined ground, while the protagonist, face twisted with grief and fury, focused on the direction the force had departed. He bellowed a single command, ordering pursuit, and his voice cracked across the hollow plain, a raw, urgent demand that the remaining fighters chase the fleeing presence before it vanished entirely. Around him, those who could move hesitated only a moment before the tense scramble toward the trailing smoke began, the race after the unknown now unavoidable. They followed the smoking trail until it abruptly ended on a sun-bleached slope, and the group slowed to a halt where the marks faded into plain sand. Two figures reached the spot first, the red-haired second captain, who announced the trail's cessation and offered a sharp, knowing smile as she suggested their quarry had been gone long before they arrived. Others crouched to inspect the ground and found only scuffed earth and a shallow split in the soil, no bodies, no clear trace. The red-haired woman called out names, Gia, Ai, and Joel, as if demanding confirmation that the missing were not hidden nearby. A blonde pursuer, Tang Tang, snapped that they should have kept running, his voice cutting through the quiet. The protagonist stepped between impatience and action and urged calm, tamping down the rush. For a moment the chase itself stalled, as the team traded accusation and restraint while the empty landscape answered them with silence. They had followed the smoking trail until it vanished on a sun-bleached slope, and after a tense search, the group stood over scuffed earth and a shallow split in the soil. The red-haired second captain observed the empty ground while a blonde figure knelt, pressing a hand to the sand to check for traces. That touch seemed to pull something from beneath the earth. A grotesque, skull-like apparition flashed across the ground as if dredging a memory or summoning an attack. Then the calm shattered. Someone screamed, and the blonde was struck hard, thrown back with a blast of force. The strike drove him to his knees. He sobbed and repeated that it was his fault for letting this happen, grief and self-blame spilling out even as the rest of the team tensed and moved in to help and to guard against whatever unknown presence had just revealed itself. They paused on the ridge to decide their next move. The blue-haired protagonist counseled caution and keeping together, while the red-haired second captain fretted over a twisted ankle and the fate of the fallen blonde commander. They knelt and checked the blonde's condition, speaking in clipped, urgent phrases as concern threaded their words. As one of them reached toward the wounded officer, a dark, unnatural hand snaked into view and brushed the man's skin, prompting alarm and a hasty withdrawal. Tension hung thick until a close, bearded figure rose, murmured acceptance, and broke into a run. His silhouette vanished into a cloud of dust as he sprinted off to act. The protagonists stepped forward with a half-teasing call to Lang Lang, their voice cutting the tightness for a moment. The brief levity did nothing to ease the worry, but it pushed them forward toward whatever came next. They traded a quick exchange of smug reassurance and pointed observation on the ridge, the protagonists' words nudging the group's intent, while the red-haired second captain listened with a wary expression. Their banter dissolved as they noticed an abrupt change in terrain and a dark aperture yawning below. Curiosity and caution pushed them to investigate. One by one, they lowered themselves into the hollow, and the light narrowed until they stood inside a cool, echoing cavity. From the blackness, a face looked up. A pale figure with bright yellow eyes peered from the gloom and answered their question about being underground. For a breath, the atmosphere stilled, then the figure's gaze snapped alive. Something moved at its back, and the scene detonated from quiet apprehension into sudden, violent alarm as the unknown presence made an aggressive motion toward them. They had dropped into the cold cavity and met a pale face with yellow eyes. What had been an inscrutable presence snapped into motion and revealed itself as a fanged demonic figure. The skull demon moved with sudden, predatory speed, its maw and claws answering their silence with a taunt about scent and kinship. It sounded almost curious, coaxing a reaction as it pressed the attack. The protagonist flinched under a brutal strike and bled, yet did not break. The wound and the insult only sharpened their focus. With a feral surge, the protagonist gathered a crimson arc of force and spun through the cramped space, blades and energy carving a wide, sweeping path. The blow cleaved through the immediate threat, sending smaller revered hand demons reeling as the skull demon's question hung in the air. Why did the protagonist smell like one of them? The moment ended with the cavern full of motion and a new, dangerous recognition between hunter and hunted. The clash had collapsed into a jagged ballet of teeth, claws, and red light as the skull demon lunged with predatory speed and a mocking curiosity about scent and kinship. The protagonist absorbed a savage blow and bled, but the injury hardened their resolve. They gathered a violent, crimson arc and spun through the cramped hollow, blades and energy shredding the immediate swarm and sending smaller revered hand demons skittering. The skull demon's taunt lingered in the cold air, even as steel sang and flesh opened, and the two traded brutal, close strikes before breaking apart across the cavern's span. Each measured the other in the aftermath, wounds, breathing, and the echo of the question that threatened to rewrite identity. The scene closed on a charged, wary distance between hunter and hunted, both poised for the next, more dangerous move. The skull demon dismissed the assault as futile and exploited the moment. Its jagged limbs and red, serrated energy arcs carved through the air and struck the protagonist with surgical brutality. The strike found the protagonist's chest and side, drawing blood and sending bright streaks of energy across their form while the warrior reeled, vision flashing and resolve hardening. Without pause, the demon converted that momentum into a vertical, punishing maneuver. Against a crimson backdrop, its silhouette loomed large as it hauled the protagonist upward. The motion ended in a sudden, grisly rupture. The protagonist hung suspended, rent and bleeding, small fragments tumbling away in a stark, almost cartoonish scatter. The cavern filled with the echo of the wound and the demon's remorseless posture as both combatants registered the new, harsher terms of the fight and braced for what would come next. After the guttural impact and the scattered fragments fell, the skull demon exploited the momentum without mercy, jeering that resistance was pointless. Its jagged, red-lace strikes slammed into the protagonist again, carving across the warrior's face and chest. Blood spattered a cracked lens as the protagonist's expression flickered between shock and stubborn defiance. Energy ribbons coiled around the protagonist's torso, and the faint glow at their chest pulsed under assault, but every attempt to push back was smothered by the demon's relentless pressure. The demon's silhouette filled the frame, a hulking shadow against a crimson wash, and with a single vertical motion, it began to haul the wounded figure skyward. The cavern seemed to close in with the echo of the demon's taunt, and the protagonist's labored breaths as both combatants were forced into a harsher, decisive pitch of the fight. The fight's momentum carried the protagonist upward as the skull demon tightened its grip and suspended the wounded warrior against a blood-red void, the silhouette sharp and uncompromising. The cavern's echoes and the demon's jeering left no room for respite. Every strained breath and flinch of the protagonist registered like distant thunder as the hulking form asserted dominance. Abruptly, the brutal sequence surrendered to a single stylized tableau, a close, cinematic portrait of a horned, split visage, human eyes burning with cold light, while red, organic tendrils crawled across skin and horn, skulls looming at the shoulders like trophies. The visual read as both a threat and a claim, the tendrils threading intent through the image before resolving into the story's title and production credits, a dark seal that reframed the struggle as something larger and more uncanny. A stark title card cut the dark sequence, then the battle resumed without mercy. The protagonist threw himself at the horned, skull-masked attacker in a desperate bid for an opening, fingers closing on a joint as they collided. The grasp earned him a wound, blood and shock flared across his body, yet in that instant he spotted a tactical vulnerability. The creature's articulation, the very seams where limb met limb, gave him the only chance to turn the tide. He voiced the discovery aloud, a ragged thought forced into action, a weakness, like its joints, as crimson light and motion lines emphasized both the pain he took and the fragile promise of an opening. The panel ended on that tense pivot, the protagonist wounded, but having identified a precise target for his next, risky strike. After the brief title cut, the protagonist remained on the ground, blood slicking his fingers as he clung to the horned, skull-masked limb and felt its articulation seem exactly the weakness he needed. He wrapped his hand around a pale, segmented appendage studded with red nodes, the grasp exposing both his wound and the creature's mechanical joint. Pain flared, but it sharpened his focus. He snarled a vow to tear its limbs off and used his injured body as leverage. With a sudden, brutal motion, he launched himself, driving a clawed, armored arm into the exposed socket and wrenching hard. Motion lines and crimson spray emphasized each pull as he sought to shear the limb from its hinge, the creature reeling under the assault. The sequence closed on the violent momentum of his strike, limbs straining and metal and flesh in splintering conflict, leaving the outcome unresolved in mid-action. The protagonist lay battered but relentless, fingers slick with blood as he found the articulation seam in the horned, skull-masked limb and wrapped his hand around the pale, segmented appendage studded with red nodes. Pain sharpened him. He used his wounded body as leverage and drove a clawed, armored arm into the exposed socket, wrenching and tearing while motion lines and crimson spray marked each brutal pull. The scene snapped to close-ups of the skull demon's tooth-rimmed maw and the protagonist's blood-smeared face, green ichor flecking both combatants. Even injured, the protagonist snarled insults and claimed he'd slain demons of that caliber before, daring the creature to underestimate him. The skull demon offered nothing but a low, amused chuckle, an indifferent heh, as the violent momentum held on a knife edge, the outcome still uncertain and the confrontation charged with defiant fury. The protagonist seized the exposed articulation of the horned, skull-masked limb and, using his battered body as leverage, ripped and wrenched at the pale, segmented appendage until crimson and green fluids sprayed across them both. Close-ups caught the protagonist's blood-smeared face, teeth bared, eyes blazing, and the tooth-rimmed maw of the skull demon, whose expression remained almost amused as the fighter cursed and dared it with raw, defiant words. With a final, brutal pull, the violence released a towering torque. Motion lines screamed outward as the demon was torn free and spun into the air, limbs skittering through a cyclone of wind and debris. The battlefield blurred into arcs of motion, and the sound of a howling vortex as both combatants rode the violent momentum apart. The confrontation hung on the edge of resolution, the protagonist's victory not yet assured, and the skull demon still a looming, taunting presence. After the cyclone of motion sent the two combatants tearing apart, the protagonist crumpled against a fractured stone face, clutching a ragged, bloodied wound as dark ichor dripped from a jagged aperture high above. Dust and mist swirled through the blasted corridor, while the circular fracture on the wall marked where violence had struck, streaks of black trailed down toward the fallen fighter. From the gloom, a rasping voice broke the hush, taunting, nervous, then defiant, admitting its vulnerability and then declaring itself a wood type. Green, vegetal energy coalesced around a shadowed, skeletal limb in the foreground, coils of living vine-like tendrils snaking outward and beginning to pulse. The scene closed on the protagonist's hunched silhouette and the accreting plant matter, the outcome suspended between prospective recovery and a new, unsettling counter, an ominous shift that promised regeneration or a fresh threat. The panels opened with the skeletal envoy demonstrating a shockingly calm resolve, coils of green, vine-like energy wrapped around its torn flesh as it announced, matter-of-factly, that its redwood type core allowed it to mend itself. The protagonist, bloodied and dazed, watched in disbelief as the healing power manifested, a small luminous core hovering nearby emphasizing the unnatural effect. Internally, the protagonist raced through years of doctrine and expectation. Green core demons alone were supposed to possess regenerative ability, and the realization that this foe had called itself a wood type sent a cold surge of alarm through him. He wondered aloud whether, after half a century, the demons had evolved their classifications and capacities beyond recorded bounds. The sequence tightened into a close-up of his fevered, yellow eyes, then snapped back to the skull demon, which returned the gaze with a bitter, almost wounded accusation. The demon reminded him that he had been the one who looked down on it, turning the reveal into a personal, ominous challenge. After the skeletal envoy's calm revelation about its unnatural wood-type core, and the protagonist's stunned realization that demon classifications might have shifted, the confrontation sharpened into violence. The skull demon flexed a gaunt, taloned hand with predatory deliberation, and from that motion thin, barbed shards formed and streaked outward like frozen needles. They tore through the smoke and struck the protagonist, the shards biting into flesh and armor, while the warrior's vision blurred and his fevered, yellow eyes widened. The demon's voice then cut through the chaos, a single, commanding, "Come," and the word arrived as the prelude to a brutal wave of force. The skull demon unleashed a sweeping strike that slammed into the protagonist and hurled him away across the battlefield. The sequence left the protagonist winded and airborne, the implications of the demon's earlier claim still echoing even as his body fell under another, more immediate threat. After the skeletal envoy's unnerving claim about its wood-like core and the jagged shards that had bitten into him, the protagonist had been hurled across the battlefield and ridden with disorientation. As he tumbled, the skull demon moved with predatory precision. A taloned limb closed about the protagonist's torso and stopped his momentum outright.